Welcome. It's a classic teaching story. A beggar had been sitting by the side of the road for over 30 years. And one day a stranger walked by, and as usual, the beggar said, "Is there anything you can give me?" Just kind of mechanically asking the question. And the stranger paused and said, "I have nothing to give you, I'm sorry." He stood there for a while, and then he asked a question. He said, "What's that you're sitting on?" And the beggar said, "Well, nothing. It's just an old box. I've been sitting on this box for as long as I can remember." The stranger asked another question, said, "Have you ever looked inside?" And the beggar said, "No. What's the point? There's nothing in there, just an old box." And the stranger insisted, saying, "Take a look inside." So the beggar managed to pry open the lid, and with astonishment and disbelief and with elation, he saw the box was filled with gold. And therein lies the metaphor for this talk and maybe for our lives. That what you're looking for may already be here. Some traditions say that what you're seeking is closer than you can imagine. The key is to look inside rather than outside. And it seems pretty clear that we tend to look outside ourselves for happiness. And more than that, we become fixated on happiness outside ourselves. And how do you stop that searching outside yourself? Or how do you redirect that natural movement of the mind? That's the topic for tonight. Renunciation. That's a heavy word. I like to think of renunciation as letting go of what doesn't serve you and embracing what does. And in one way, you can see it as letting go of external focus and opening to internal focus. As one great teacher said, all you seek is found within. A couple other quotes just to share with you. Mahatma Gandhi said, "A person of knowledge attains peace only through renunciation." Wow. So if you want knowledge and peace, it's only through this inquiry into letting go of what doesn't serve you. So that's the East. Here's someone from the West, Andrew Carnegie, who said, "The secret of happiness is renunciation." What? Freud, "It's impossible to overlook the extent to which civilization is built upon a renunciation of instinct. Society is built on the renunciation of instinct." Harshatwala, last quote. "In the journey of life, it's not what you do, it's what you don't do that matters most." So here we are in part 3 on the 10 perfections on renunciation. And what I'd like to talk about, part 1, know what you deeply want and what you truly want. In part 2, address what's between you and what you deeply and truly want. Part 3, simplify and dedicate your life to what you deeply and truly want. And part 4, keep remembering what you truly and deeply want. So, know what you deeply and truly want. There's an interesting headline some years back. Why 3% of Harvard's MBAs make 10 times as much as the other 97% combined. Well, that intrigued me. Harvard, as you know, has a very, very low acceptance rate, and most people there are pretty standout. What they found in this survey they did, and I don't know when they did this survey, but 84% of MBA graduates had no specific goals. 13% had goals, but they hadn't written them down, and 3% had clear written goals and plans. So many, many years later, The 13% who had some goals were earning twice as much as the 84% who had no goals at all. And the 3% were earning 10 times as much as the other 97%. So I'm not advocating that making money is the end all and be all, but for many, it's very interesting to reflect on how knowing what you want tends to drive and focus your attention. It's one way you can sort of measure progress is when you know where you're actually headed. And so it's just important to acknowledge that this is a fundamental part of life and a very fundamental part of spiritual practice as well. What do you really, really want? It's important to ask that. And if you were to just to reflect now, a little Zen pop quiz, if you can close your eyes, you can take 3 slow, deep breaths. If you were to write down your top 3 callings in life right now, what would they be? Your top 3 callings in life. So if you have a sense of them, you might want to write them down, and you'll be, according to that Harvard study, more effective than people who don't. I always like to mention this about the 10 perfections because it's a really confusing title. 10 perfections implies that if you don't do these perfectly, then you're not perfect. So it's a setup for self-judgment, self-criticism, and all that stuff. But it can be seen as like the 10 best practices, if you will. So really what it comes down to is there a better and more effective way to move toward what I want? And I think it's pretty clear that if you know what you want, then you can sort of measure how you're doing against that. This path, or the path of awakening, if you will, it turns into, there are 2 questions. One is the path of self-improvement. That's always getting better in every way. It's becoming a better partner, better listener, more focused, better meditator. And then there's the path of liberation, of just cutting through all that stuff. The 10 perfections can be seen as a never-ending laundry list of continuous self-improvement, kind of like a treadmill. But they can also be seen as these facets of a gem that you can polish. So what is most important? I spend a lot of time on this because I've really come to recognize how critical it is. That where the attention goes, the energy flows. I have worldly goals, stuff I want to get done in this life while I'm here. But I think some of the intangibles for me is what I really want is to feel happy no matter what the circumstances. I want to feel like I'm a contribution to do what I love and maybe to offer some benefit, to kind of be awake to reality. Those are lofty goals. And I fail miserably over and over and over. But that's part of the practice. Is when you focus on what you want, you automatically start to encounter challenges and difficulties. And part of the practice, from what I understand, is remembering what you want and then looking at how you can skillfully move toward that. So this is part of the calling of life. You're called into your journey, and then you start hitting difficulties. So I recently hit a big snag. This is actually a couple of years ago when I first tried this. YouTube tends to be the bane of my existence. I don't know what it is about seeing moving images. When I grew up, we only got 1.5 television channels, and then I just never watched TV. So when I see moving images, it just captures my attention. So there's this thing called YouTube Red, if you're not familiar with it. And basically they say, are you tired of those distracting ads? Well, here's a free trial. And all those annoying YouTube ads just disappear. And so I thought, I'll give it a shot. Technology is so interesting. it can be such a force for good, and then not so good. But the internet has amazing ways to share information, to help communities form, to share information. The other day, something was broken in the ice maker in my fridge, and on YouTube, there was someone showing me how to fix it. So anything you need to figure out mechanically, YouTube is awesome. So I signed up for this month-long trial, and guess what? I started watching a lot more YouTube. I mean, really dumb YouTube, like time-killing, brain-numbing YouTube. And I could feel the addiction setting in. How I would just get lost into these romps through looking at the historical accuracy of a movie, looking at, I watched a review of a camera that I already own, comparing camera bags. I don't need a camera bag. And I realized to myself, eventually, I got to get out of this. I got to dump this service. It's appalling at how much time that I got lost in. And so it becomes a very interesting element when you think about what you want and then what gets in the way of what you want. How much time during the day are you spending on things that are not related to what you most want? How many hours and days slip by? So what happens is when you focus on a goal, whether it be a tangible goal or kind of an intangible goal of how you want to live your life and how you want to feel at the end of your life, you start to see into the nature of mind. You start to see that one part of your mind is scanning for danger to keep you alive, and another part of your mind is scanning for pleasure. And there's so much candy out there in the world right now. And if you've looked closely at the science of how you get hooked in through social media, it's kind of terrifying. Because perhaps like me, you have a sense of how addictive it becomes, how these algorithms find out what you like and start feeding you more of what you like to keep your eyeballs on the screen. I'm so grateful I'm of the generation before video games. Otherwise, I think I would have lost this incarnation. So it becomes a question of really reflecting on what gets in the way of you focusing on what's near and dear to you. And if we don't pay attention, our attention gets fractured into 1,000 different places. And this leads to this exploration of this teaching around renunciation, this teaching around letting go of what does not serve your highest calling. And like in the teaching on ethics, it can sound a lot like thou shalt not. That's part of it. But it's an invitation to step in much, much deeper into what's important in your life, and then how to align your life around that. In many ways, it's the art of simplifying. And specifically, you could say it's about turning away from sense pleasure as a means of gaining happiness. And then this brings up a lot of questions for a lot of people around, well, what is this practice of renunciation? What does that mean? And there's sort of classical interpretations, and then there are more modern interpretations, and ultimately there's your interpretation of how you can apply this in your life in a way that's gonna fuel you. So there's a story about Ananda, who was the Buddha's assistant. He went to the Buddha and he sat down and he said, there are those of us householders, that is, those not non-monks, who indulge in sexuality, delight in sensuality, enjoy and rejoice. Yet I've heard the doctrine of renunciation, and I know that young monks leap up at renunciation, grow confidence, steadfast and firm, being at peace. Right here is where the doctrine and discipline are contrary to the great mass of people. So Ananda is saying, hey, there are a lot of us here who find sexuality, sensuality, and life, enjoying life as great. And yet here are these young monks who really have, they're getting lit up. They have confidence. Um, they have this sense of being steadfast and firm. Like, I love my life, but I can't imagine why some people jump at the chance to take vows of poverty and celibacy. I like the idea, but it seems extreme. It's basically what he's saying. And so the Buddha says, so it is. So it is. Even I myself, before my self-awakening, when I was still an unawakened bodhisattva, thought, renunciation is good. Seclusion is good. But my heart didn't leap up at renunciation. It didn't grow confident, steadfast, or firm. So the Buddha is saying, yeah, it's the same way for me. The Buddha goes on to say, and I'm going to paraphrase here, then the thought occurred to me, what is the cause? What is the reason why my heart doesn't leap up at renunciation? That it doesn't go confident, steadfast, or firm? And then the thought occurred to me, I haven't seen the drawback of sensual pleasures. I haven't pursued that theme. I haven't familiarized myself with it. That's why my heart doesn't leap up. So the Buddha is basically saying here, I realized I never really thought about it. I didn't think this through. Then, the Buddha said, the thought occurred to me, if having seen the drawback of sensual pleasures, if I were to pursue that theme, and if I understood the reward of renunciation, if I were to familiarize myself with it, there's the possibility that my heart would leap up at renunciation and grow confident and steadfast and firm. And so basically the Buddha said, well, maybe if I look at this closer, I can start to see what the benefits are. And so he goes on to say, when I remained there, I was beset with attention to perceptions dealing with sensuality. That was an affliction for me. Just as pain arises as an affliction for a healthy person, so does the attention to perceptions dealing with sensuality. That can beset me as an affliction. So here the Buddha is saying, I realize just as I'm pushing away pain, it takes me away from being fully awake, so does pursuing pleasure. That's actually an equal force that takes me away from being present. So when I looked closer and experimented, the Buddha said, I saw not only was it beneficial, but it ushered me into an experience of rapture and pleasure, of concentration and clarity. So the Buddha is saying, when I really gave it a shot, not only was it good, it was mind-blowing. So this exploration of letting go of pushing away and grasping, if you like, you can close your eyes just for a few moments, another little Zen pop quiz. Just again, you might just feel the breath. Take one slow, full, deep breath. And you might just explore these following questions. What would your experience of this moment be if there was no desire? In the absence of any pushing away or any grasping, what is the quality of this moment? If you like, you can deepen your breath, and if you like, you can open your eyes. You can remain with them closed. No one's watching. This was not somewhat, this was my experience. I've had the incredible opportunity to go through periods of time in my life where I was able to actually explore renunciation, formal renunciation. I took a vow of what we called simplicity, which was basically a vow of poverty for about 13 or 14 years living in a spiritual community. And I had a formal vow of celibacy for a little over 6 years. I've shared about this before, but I think probably the poverty vow was easier for me. I was in my 20s and 30s, but the celibacy vow in my 20s and 30s, some major growth opportunities. To be in this community, which I was so intrigued by the experience there, it was required that you would refrain from romantic relationships for a minimum of 4 years. Being in my 20s and 30s and full of vigor, it seemed unimaginable, but I thought I'd give it a try. And not only was it helpful, but it too brought me to very, very powerful internal experiences. I think I learned more about myself in those years than ever before. And again, I've touched on this before, but basically, when I made the commitment to refrain from romantic relationships and to refrain from sensuality and sexuality in particular, one thing I realized was how outer focused I was in regard to my own inner happiness. I was focused on the idea of a relationship, the concept of a relationship, the entire projection onto other people in this fantasy world. It was pulling me away from my own internal experience. I was also became very self-consciously and kind of humiliatingly aware of how I was constantly posturing myself around relationships where I was romantically or sexually attracted, and how much it was all external focused. So everything I was doing was around getting the response that I thought I wanted. When I made this firm commitment to not crossing the line into physical intimacy, something incredibly paradoxical arose. I had more intimacy. Relationships I would have pursued but not had the emotional maturity to maintain became very, very deep friendships. And paradoxically, more intimacy than ever in my life. And at the same time, all that outer energy, because I was practicing pretty deeply, suddenly began to fuel my internal practice, my internal world. We have so many life energy units available to us. When those life energy units are all focused outside and those doors are closed, that energy has to go somewhere. And where it went for me was this dramatically heightened sense of self-awareness. My meditation practice became so much more profound. And the sense of absorption and rapture and internal pleasure was so rich and so deep. I'm so grateful for those years, and I'm grateful they're in the past, because there are other ways to explore sensuality and sexuality that can be equally, if not more powerful. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But the idea here is around simplicity. In yogic terms, we are practicing what's called brahmacharya. And brahmacharya basically means moderation of the senses. So you're pulling back from sensual engagement. And so for many, many years, I lived in what was literally a monk's cell for, I think, about 12 years. I've had different times of living in a very, very small space with my favorite 4 pair of pants, my favorite 4 shirts, a few favorite books. And there's something about embracing the simplicity that can be so profound. So profound to be surrounded by a few things that you really appreciate. Now, there are lots of interpretations around renunciation. We have sort of like the orthodox hardcore, then we have sort of the reformed, adapted to your life. The classical teachings, or some of the classical teachings around renunciation, are kind of designed to reveal the impermanence of the body. In different traditions, there are meditations on a rotting corpse. There are meditations you do kind of open-eyed on a body being cremated. There are meditations you can do meditating on the components of the body, imagining these buckets of different body parts of skin in this bucket and hair in this bucket and bile in this bucket and other fluids in this bucket and fat in this bucket. What it can do is it can sort of break down the fascination of the body as something attractive and underscore the impermanence of the body. Some would say it's designed to kind of revile the body, but my sense is that I think that the higher sense of it is that these practices are designed to reveal the fact of impermanence rather than just disgust, although that's certainly part of it. So when you break these teachings down, it kind of comes down to number one, the fact of stress and suffering in life. That all life experiences carry with them some seed of desire, which sets the whole chain of stress and suffering in motion. The second here, that there's a cause, there's a source of that stress and suffering. And the understanding that you cannot eliminate suffering by satisfying cravings, because the sensory pleasures just create more pleasures and more suffering. And so this whole concept of renunciation is about reversing that chain. I'm not happy, let me satisfy the senses. Oh, I feel better. More senses, more senses. So a lot of these teachings point to avoiding sensory contact or seeing its nature of impermanence. So for me in my 20s and 30s, just refraining from romantic relationships. Here's the wall. I needed that. I needed something dramatic to sort of give me that feedback. But I think it's more than that. Chogyam Trungchen Rinpoche said, it's not just a matter of giving up attachment to this life's rewards, but of losing our taste and affinity for the whole of worldly existence. That's why it's necessary to contemplate and meditate upon the faults of conditioned existence. Consider a person who has a sickness that causes vomiting. As soon as he sees something revolting, he will immediately retch uncontrollably. This is how you should feel toward conditioned existence, a sense of revulsion rather than attraction. That's a pretty powerful point of view. Think of conditioned existence as something that makes you retch uncontrollably. So there are those who say, don't go there. Just don't go into the senses, because it's a doorway into a never-ending spin of ongoing stress and suffering. And this isn't some Asian macho thing. It's not limited to Buddhism or yoga. Christianity and all other traditions have some element of viewing the body and worldly life with disgust. And sometimes we need it. Sometimes we need these powerful, dramatic boundaries to help to wake us up. But I also feel that there is a more moderate approach. And it's the teaching of the middle way. One of the sutras here says, two extremes should not be practiced. Number one, indulgence of sense pleasure, which is low, coarse, the way of ordinary people, unworthy and unprofitable. So that's number one. Indulging in sense pleasures, not a lot of payoff down that road. The other extreme to avoid, self-mortification, which is painful, unworthy, and unprofitable. So neither denying the senses or indulging the senses is going to be supportive. So what are these teachings pointing toward in all these wisdom traditions? In many ways, they're about pointing toward seeing into the nature of impermanence, the reality of impermanence. Knowing that everything that you can see and touch and taste and smell is going to disappear, including you, points toward how you might navigate this worldly life. Is it about denial of the body, or is there a more balanced approach? And here we have this pointing toward the middle way, this very, very delicate state where you're not grasping, you're not pushing away, but you're opening into being. And rather than the approaches of pushing away, of denial of the body, and here this points towards some of the amazing practices that are about being in the world and being awake to the body. The practice of Tantra, for example, where, and again, this is an oversimplification, but as someone said, I think it was Georg Feuerstein, said there are two forms of Tantra. There's California Tantra, and then Tantra. We tend to think of Tantra as the ritual of sacred sex when it's so much more. Tantra really points toward the kind of the interplay of form and space. It points toward embracing the fact of impermanence and engaging into the world, into life. It's jet fuel. The tantric sexual practices are incredible because you're actually fully lighting up all of the senses, opening up energetically, and at the same time acknowledging and embracing impermanence and emptiness. So anytime that you want something in your life, chances are you're sacrificing something to get it. There's a question that seems really relevant to me. What do you want? What are you willing to give up to get it? So when you do a retreat, a meditation retreat, for example, you make a commitment to not distract yourself. We talked earlier about kind of the ethics and values. You make a commitment not to speak. You make a commitment not to steal. You make a commitment, not to lie, which is part of not speaking. You make all these commitments, some of the very specific around retreat, not to read, not to write, not to leave the grounds, to just accept what's freely given. You're removing these distractions while you're going inward. There's just nowhere to go other than here and now. And when you do that, there can be a very powerful release and purging of memories, of seeing attachments, of suffering. Everything between you and feeling free just kind of gets flushed out to be seen and named and held and released. I have had on meditation retreats some of my most powerful experiences of rapture, levels of inner bliss. Not only hadn't I not experienced them before, I hadn't really imagined them before. And part of that experience was from what I was doing, the concentration and metta and all of that. But a lot of it had to do with what I was not doing. I was not fracturing my attention in 100 different directions. I was beginning to pick up more and more of a sense of concentrated moment-to-moment awareness. And I think that's what this teaching points to, is learning how to stay focused on what's most important in your life and renouncing what gets in the way of that. Anything you wanted, anything you really wanted probably involved some sacrifice. Getting a degree means you're not going to focus on a lot of other stuff. Being in a relationship means sacrificing your preferences to include the other person's point of view. Working toward a project means you're limiting distractions. Being a good parent means letting go of all of your preferences to really be there present for your family. And many people who've achieved some success in life have learned how to cut out those distractions. They've learned how to let go and sacrifice toward their goal. Some of it's kind of simple. I was really inspired by President Obama when I read that he only has 2 suits. He said, I have to make decisions all day long. I'm not going to waste my energy on what suit I'm going to wear. And that inspired me to actually limit my wardrobe. So for the last many years, I just have gray, black, and white. I love it. And no distractions. Other ways that I kind of practically use this sense of limiting distractions, I have an app that I use. It's called Focus at Will. And it uses binaural beats and certain soundtracks that kind of help you to maintain focus. So I put on my headphones and I set the timer for 25 minutes, and I try to work in these 25-minute increments where I'm doing just one thing without distraction. And I have to say, boy, has that made a difference. Another thing I do, which I mentioned before, is I write down 3 things that I'm going to accomplish per day. And I do those first. And I put on my headphones, try to remove distractions. And sometimes it's stunning what I can do in 25 minutes as opposed to about 4 hours of fractured attention. So, knowing what you want, and then reflecting on what you're willing to sacrifice, what you're willing to let go of to support that, can be really helpful. And you may have noticed how sometimes you can be really, really effective and really focused, and other times you can't. The key, I think, here has something to do around these principles of renunciation, of letting go of what doesn't serve you. A good friend of mine has a medical clinic. He's a doctor. He's head of this clinic. We were chatting. He said, hey, you want to save $20,000? I said, sure. He said, I've spent about $20,000 on being an entrepreneur, going to all these workshops and trainings. He said, let me save you the money. Here's the bottom line. Figure out what you do best and don't do anything else. There's a lot of power in that. And the key is to not do what is not part of your mission and your goals. It requires some kind of brutal self-honesty, I think. In that same way, when you're meditating, you're turning your attention inward. The idea is you're cultivating present moment, non-judging awareness. And when you do that, when thoughts arise, you push them away. You become more aware of the weather systems of the mind, of how wanting and desire occludes present moment, non-judging awareness. How judging, blame, worry, sleepiness, doubt, all these different states become much, much more part of your experience in meditation and life. You begin to recognize what's between you and where you are directing your attention. It makes it harder, but it's also incredibly powerful, because inevitably you begin to see more into the nature of impermanence, how everything changes, how everything falls away. You begin to see into the nature of stress, how what you're identified with leads to intense dissatisfaction. And you start to see into your true nature. So, how do you cultivate this sense of renunciation? The first, again, is to really identify what calls you in this life. What lights you up? And then to look carefully and honestly at what and how do you fracture your attention? What gets in the way? And then to look skillfully at how you might look at some of the skillful means, and to be honest about what you need to move toward what most supports you. And I subscribe to that line that company is stronger than willpower. when I'm aligned with other people who want what I want, that is a force that's incredibly powerful. And I think that's an important thing to reflect on as you, if you're inspired to align your life more around what you want. What are you willing to give up? And what are you willing to receive in terms of support to move toward that? What I find is every time you step back from the world, whether it's just for meditation or anytime you pause, anytime you deeply refresh, you return more alive. I grew up in southeastern Pennsylvania, and we had lots of these limestone caves, and I used to go spelunking. And one of the things I loved about spelunking was spending a couple hours underground. That was fun and interesting and scary and adventurous. But what always blew my mind was when I came out of the cave, the smells, the sights, the colors were just amazing. That sense of like withdraw and re-engage. All the stuff I just took for granted I saw when all that was taken away. So a critical part of this, and each one of us has to figure this out for ourselves. What can you do that most enlivens you, where you can step back from the world and deeply, deeply refresh? So renunciation is not necessarily about letting go of pleasure. It can be perhaps the sense of like letting go of short-term pleasure for long-term pleasure. For me, in my formal practice of celibacy, I was letting go of short-term sensual satisfaction that resulted in a long-term pleasure of intimacy and connection. The question, again, what do you want? What would most support you in that? What are the practices that can move you toward what really calls your heart? And what are the practices of renunciation? What is it that you're willing to not do that can cultivate that outcome? Why don't we take just a few minutes before we close? If you like, you can close your eyes. And as you close your eyes, you might slow down and deepen your breath. And just a sense for yourself in these final minutes. What calls you in life? How would you like to feel in this life journey? And is there a sense of the practices, the actions, the behaviors that would support you in moving toward that? And is there a sense of what gets in the way? What fractures your attention? What pulls you away from what you sense you most want in this life? And if you were in some way to refrain from that which does not serve you, what would that feel like? What would that be like? As you're ready, you can deepen your breath, and as you're ready, you can open your eyes. Just one final thought to share with you. When you know what most calls you, And when you say no to something that takes you away, it's so helpful to remember you're saying yes to something else. So when I say no to YouTube, what I'm saying yes to is I want my attention to go here. And that can be a very joyous distinction. That whenever you find yourself saying no, what is it you're saying yes to? We are so drawn to thinking all the answers are out there, and we forget that we're sitting on this little box of gold. And as you explore this topic and what this means for you, how no might mean yes for you, I so wish you well as you navigate your way through this part of your journey. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I so wish you well. May your no's clearly be yeses that fill your heart and your life. Take good care.